Let's talk a little bit about controlling my lure with my spinning rod, because that's really day in and day out what catches this fish, right? Once we've made an accurate cast. So I'm gonna put a bait out here in the water for a minute. Let's say that I'm fishing a jig, okay? Most of the time, first of all, I'm barely holding on to this. Most of the time, my rod tip's gonna be very high. It's gonna be somewhere between about 30 degrees above horizontal and straight up. I never want my rod back here. You have no chance of doing anything when your rod's clear back there. So you need to have your rod no more than it's getting bit. You want to have your rod no more than about at, I would say, 75 degrees of angle. So for my jig, I'm gonna throw, I'm gonna close my bail, and I'm gonna stop with my rod tip high. Then I can follow the jig down with the rod and control that slack as the bait goes to the bottom, okay? Then I'll reel up some slack, and notice I don't keep my hand on the spinning reel. I'll spin the reel down to my bait, and then use my very sensitive rod to lift my bait back, and then reel down to my bait and use my very sensitive rod to lift my bait back. That way I can feel what's going on. Then I'm back to here, and then I can watch that line. If that line won't sink, I know I'm on the bottom or I'm bit. If I don't have control of that slack, I have no idea what's going on with it. Now, there are times when I'll work a bait tip down, at which point, if you look, I'm not even holding on to this rod. I'm gonna drag it. This would be a classic example of dragging a tube jig or a live bait rig, maybe for a walleye. Maybe you're dragging a Lindy rig or something. Then I'm gonna drag it tip down. You can see it's bit right there. I'm gonna drag it tip down, and I'm not even holding on to this rod. I'm letting the rod do all the work as I pull this back, and I'll wind back to the bait, and then I'll tip down. But again, the rod's just hanging in my hand in that scenario, okay? Now, if it's gonna be something like a crankbait or a jerkbait or a topwater bait, let's try one of those. We'll take this jerkbait out, and you guys have seen this a lot on the show. We're gonna make our standard overhand cast, throw it out here, catch the line, close the bail. Incidentally, by feathering this line, it will keep your bait from tumbling in the air so much as well. It will keep it from doing this in the air. It's a little bit of resistance. But there, I'm gonna have the rod tip down again. It's just hanging in my hand, tip down, and I'm just gonna bounce it. If you notice, the back of the rod is coming up inside of my humerus right here. That's my standard jerkbait deal. And people say, don't you get tired doing that? Well, I'm not even holding on to it. It's just the weight of the rod is all that's doing all the work. And you see how bouncy the rod tip is? It's doing all the work. As soon as it hits the resistance, that jerkbait in the water, it'll bounce off, okay? Really, really simple. Now, if this was a crankbait, I'd probably have it tip down. Again, I'm barely holding on to it, but now I'm just gonna wind it. Okay? Or maybe I'm gonna sweep it and then wind back to it and then sweep it. But look how loose my grip is. My grip on this rod is nothing because I wanna know what's going on with my bait. And if I'm gripping it right here, I have no idea what's going on with my bait. But I'll just sweep the rod back to me. That's a very common scenario with a crankbait for me, is to sweep it back or to just evenly wind it. Let's say I'm throwing an inline spinner for trout. I don't ever want my rod pointed straight at my bait, because if your rod's pointed straight at your bait, straight down the line, there's no give in your system anywhere. If fish hits that end of it, he's got no give at all. So I always want at least a little bit of angle on my rod so that I have a little bit of tip to deflect. For one, that gives me a little bit of extra visual bite detection because the rod will deflect. And for two, it gives me a little bit of give at that end. Should a fish bite that thing while it's moving, the rod can flex and take some of it. If the rod's pointed right at it, the only give you have is the stretch of the line. And in the case with this X9 braid, that's effectively zero. So that doesn't help you at all. So where my rod position is in terms of relation to my lure is dictated more by my lure itself than the spinning rod or anything else. So again, with a jig, I'm gonna throw it out and I'm gonna end up with my rod tip real high and I'm gonna follow the bait down with the rod tip, okay? With a jerkbait or a crankbait, something, I'm typically gonna be down like this and I'll work tip down to keep the bait down in the water column. Or a topwater bait, I'm certainly gonna be working tip down all the time with a topwater bait, and it'll keep the bait down in the water column the whole time, and that's gonna be really important. So your position is really, will dictate a lot by the line angle that goes into the water. But in all cases, this rod is hanging in my hand, and that's a big part of the reason why I'm such an advocate of spinning rods for something like a jerkbait, because it's not so fatiguing.